Rambam, Perek Aleph, Halacha Yud. Ad emasai chayav l'lmod Torah. Ad yom moso. Shenemar, upen yasuru milvavcha kol yemei chayecha. B'chol zman shelo yasok b'limud, hu shocheach. So let's notice a few things before we address the question where the Rambam is coming from. Just a few technical diukim if we read the Rambam meticulously. First of all, the Lashon Ad Emosai, which opens this halacha, is a language of a question, or although it's a rhetorical question, but he's nevertheless asking a question. Now, when you ask a question about a detail, Ad Emosai, until what point, then it would seem that if you want to know when and how long this chiyuv extends, you've already discussed this chiyuv. And I say this as an introduction to our analysis of the Avodas HaMelech, which is going to come around the bend very shortly. Meaning that the Ad Emasai in the Rambam is going back to something the Rambam has established previously, and the Rambam is adding now another point about that chiyuv that he's discussed until now. Now, the language ad yomoso, as opposed to biyomoso, would seem to refer to a continuum of time that ends with and includes Yom Moso. And when I read this Rambam, I was thinking of a Mishnah in Avos that says, do tshuva now because you don't know if you'll be alive tomorrow to do tshuva. So in a sense, if you tell a person he's chayiv to learn Torah ad Yom Moso, he doesn't know when Yom Moso is. He's going to have to learn Torah constantly. But if you would read the Rambam biyom Moso, which doesn't say in the Rambam, but if that's the Rambam's intention, with a little stretch, then the Rambam is saying that he knows Yom Moso, right? The doctors have told him, that's it. You've got 24 hours left to live. Now the Rambam has to derive this from a pasuk, but the Rambam feels compelled to explain how he derived his conclusion from the pasuk, because the pasuk says, "Pen yasuru milvavcha kol yemei chayecha," and Chazal interpret that as referring to shichacha. Make sure, guarantee that you don't forget your Torah. Okay, but that doesn't obligate me to study Torah, and therefore the Rambam is to justify this conclusion adds kol zman shelo yasok belimud hu shocheach. So limud is not something that you have appointed time here and appointed time here and appointed time here, and you gather together various knowledge of Torah, but rather it's got to be constant because we want to avoid shichacha, pen yasur milvavcha. And if you stop learning, then that brings shichacha, which is prohibited. Pen. Whenever it says pen in the Torah, it means an isur. So one of the questions that we want to address in this round, we'll get to it much later, is the Rambam seems to be talking about a very interesting integration of both a positive command and a negative command. On the one hand, pen yasur milvavcha is a negative command. It's a lav, which would tell you that you're not allowed to forget your Torah. On the other hand, the pen yasur milvavcha in this Rambam is being used to derive a mitzvah aseh, meaning a command that you should be constantly learning. So there are two sides of this coin. There's the avoidance of shichacha, and then there's a positive command to learn, in this case, to learn constantly, even up to and even on the day of your death. And that positive command is sort of a result of the lav of shichacha. Now, in Balabatish terms, in reality, this seems like something way beyond our capacity to avoid shichas HaTorah. I mean, if you're learning Daf Yomi, I don't want to be facetious, so I'll talk about myself so nobody suggests, but, Rabbi Berzler, could you tell me what you learned yesterday? Do you know the difference between Tumas Ochlin and Tumas Nevela? I'm saying? So to tell me that the Torah is prohibiting me from shichacha, you gotta somehow tone that down a little bit and tell me, when do I violate the pen yasur milvavcha, and it's almost considered that I actively created or caused shichacha and I violated this law. When can I be let off the hook and say, well, you did what you did what you could, you did your daf, and you moved on. So the exact specific parameters of how one would violate the pen yasur milvavcha is something that has to be addressed. That's just on a side point. But getting back to reading the Rambam writes, Kol zman shelo yasok b'limud hu shocheach. The Rambam is sort of guaranteeing us, based on this pasuk, that if you don't involve yourself constantly in the learning of Torah, then you're going to forget it. You're going to forget your Torah, and therefore, willy-nilly, you're violating the Isur Pen Yasur Milvavcha. But there's no doubt that the Rambam wants to emphasize the last three words in the pasuk, Kol Yemei Chayecha, because Kol L'Rabos Afilu Yomoso. And here's where we get into the Avodas HaMelech. The Avodas HaMelech, as always, wants to discover and point to the source of the Rambam. Where's the Rambam coming from? From whence did he derive this conclusion? So he has a Gemara in Shabbos on Daf Pei Gimel in the name of Rabbi Yonasan. Li'olam al yimna odom es atzmo b'beis hamedrash u'midivrei Torah afilu b'shas misa. So this is a very brilliant insight of the Avodas HaMelech, because Rabbi Yonasan adds in his presentation afilu b'shas misa. If not for those three words, it would be a very nice conclusion to derive from Rabbi Yonasan that one should be constantly involved in the Torah study. Don't miss the Beis Medrash for a day, and don't miss learning Divrei Torah for a day. But that would not justify the Rambam's conclusion about Ad Yom Moso. And the Rambam is medayik that from the pasuk Kol Yemei Chayecha, which we said meant even the day of your death. So that's why Afilu B'Shas Misa, even the day of your death, is a very interesting discovery of the Avodas HaMelech. You could have read the statement of Rabbi Yonasan without realizing that Rabbi Yonasan is telling you that b'shas misa you have a chiyuv of Talmud Torah. Once again, I'm not getting into the practicality of this. How do you know it's shas misa, and how lucid are you? And maybe you want to say goodbye to your family members. Maybe you want to give over your possessions and tell people where they can find, your hidden treasures or whatever. There are a lot of things that you might want to do b'shas misa. I don't know if learning a sugya in Baba Basra is the first thing on your mind at the time that you're about to die. I don't know. So that's the practical side or the impractical side of this halacha. It makes it very abstract, very idealistic. Now, where did Rabbi Yonasan get this from? Meaning, you're just pushing it up one level. You've told me the Rambam got it from Rabbi Yonasan because Rabbi Yonasan says, Al yimna odom es atzmo, etc., afilu b'shas misa. So your learning has to encompass even shas misa. But where did Rabbi Yonasan get it from? And at this point, having read the Avodas HaMelech, I would anticipate, if I cover the Gemara in Shabbos before I read it, that Rabbi Yonasan is going to quote the pasuk, "Pen yasur milvavcha kol yimei chayecha," and then explain that kol zman she'eino lomed and osek b'limud is hu shocheach. No, that's not what Rabbi Yonasan does. He quotes a different pasuk at the beginning of Parashas Chukas, Zos Toras HaAdam, and we can emphasize the word Torah here because we're talking about learning Torah, but I think the main emphasis is on Ohel. Adam ki yomus ba'ohel. And the Ohel here is also a reference or an allusion to Torah study, the Ohel of Torah. And Rabbi Yonasan derives from this Yamus that the Ohel shel Torah should be a subject of involvement, afilu b'shas misa, and tehei osek b'Torah. So that ki Yamus ba'ohel now becomes the source for deriving the conclusion that one has a chiyuv limud at the time that he leaves this world. And I derive from the Avodas HaMelech's interpretation of the Rambam that the Rambam is coming to tell me that Shas Misa is a brand new chiyuv of Esek HaTorah. And the chiddush here is that although you have a constant chiyuv of Esek HaTorah, but there's an additional chiyuv of Esek HaTorah derived from its own pasuk of Esek HaTorah b'shas misa. And it sort of doubles up your chiyuv. We've discussed this many times, that when the Rambam says Shenemar, he wants to tell you that we're deriving from a pasuk a brand new chiyuv. In the case of Rabbi Yonasan, he apparently is deriving a brand new chiyuv from a new pasuk. And that is Zos HaTorah of Adam Ki Yomus Ba'ohel. This is the Torah that you're obligated to study at the moment of Adam Ki Yomus Ba'ohel. But I'm bothered by two things here. Number one, if this is indeed the source of the Rambam, then the Rambam is sort of telling you something about Shas Misa. And the Rambam should have derived that from the pasuk of Adam Ki Yomus Ba'ohel. There's no indication whatsoever in the Rambam that he is using that pasuk to derive this conclusion, this far-reaching conclusion about Yom HaMisa. In fact, on the contrary, from the fact that the Rambam quotes the pasuk, Pen Yasur Milvavcha Kol Yimei Chayecha, you get the impression that he's not referring to the pasuk and the derivation of Adam Ki Yomus Ba'ohel. And my second objection to the Avodas HaMelech is that if the Avodas HaMelech is establishing that there's a separate chiyuv, a brand new chiyuv that the Torah established on Yom Misa, then why does the Rambam open up by saying Ad Emosai Chayav? Ad Emosai Chayav means that we've discussed a certain chiyuv, And as a continuation of that discussion, we want to add the following note that chiyuv continues until Yom HaMisa. And that reading of the Rambam, I think, is diverges from the reading of the Rambam of the Avodas HaMelech, because the Avodas HaMelech is focusing totally on Shas Misa, and he's telling me that Shas Misa is a separate chiyuv of Talmud Torah, of Esek Torah, which he finds rooted in the rulings of Rabbi Yonasan. Truth be told, there's a certain logic to it. The Shas Misa is really the transition from this world, this limited world, to the next infinite world. And, it's good to have a couple of credits, as you make that move, that transition. The transition needs, I call it in Hebrew, livui, if you're familiar with that word. Livui means an escort. So you want something to escort you into the next world. So what's going to escort you? The Limud Torah, the Esek Torah of that moment. You come from the Olam Hazeh into Olam Haba through the channels and the preoccupation with Esek Torah. And we can even add and strengthen the Avodas HaMelech by saying that what you learn at the Shas Misa is going to prove to Hashem how important your learning Torah was. It's almost Igloi Milsal Mafrei, now retroactively, all the Torah that you studied culminates in the fact that at the moment that I depart from this world, I'm studying Torah. And in a sense, since I don't know when the Shas HaMisa is, and it could always possibly spring up on me at any time, because no one knows, exactly, today in scientific statistics, they really don't know exactly, you have these actuaries and the whole science of how long they expect you to live, and the doctors say, well, you have only, nobody really can tell you when is Yom HaMisa, as we mentioned earlier. But therefore, you always have to be in a state of, maybe this is Yom HaMisa. Maybe it's, it's coming to me. And I might be surprised. I'm thinking, I don't know if you've ever heard of Aryeh Kaplan, who died at the age of 48, if I'm not mistaken. They say that he had like 22 hours work days. He just never slept. I mean, he was preoccupied. I don't think he knew he was going to pass away at that young age, but he had a mission and a goal in life, and every moment was precious. And he didn't know when life would end, so he wanted to exploit every possible moment. The famous story about two buddies that love to play baseball. Now, I know for Torontonians it's more hockey, but that's the way I heard the story, so I'll give it to you the American way. They loved baseball. So let's say there's Johnny and Jack. We'll just make up names. So Jack turns to his friend Johnny and he says, will there be baseball in Olam Haba? I love baseball. I hope I can continue playing baseball in Olam Haba. So Johnny says to Jack, you know what? Let's make a deal. Whoever gets there first will come back to this world to answer that question. So sure enough, a couple of years later, Johnny dies. He goes up to Olam Haba. And a few days later, he shows up to his friend Jack and he says, Jack, I have good news for you and bad news for you. The good news is there's baseball in Olam Haba. The bad news is that you're pitching on Sunday. But you really don't know when is your last day. He didn't expect, that this coming Sunday, So anyway, just to summarize back to, they say the best jokes are about death because the more serious the issue is, the more funny the jokes are. But anyway, just to get back to our direction here, the Avodas HaMelech is taking us, I think, in one particular direction, putting the emphasis here on Shas Misa. And in that context, we suggested that there's a special chiyuv Shas Misa according to this approach, because that is the ma'avar, as we say, to the next world. But for two reasons, and again, I'm a big fan of the Avodas HaMelech, I don't know if that definition is what the Rambam has in mind, and I doubt it, because he should have quoted that pasuk of Adam ki yamus. And second of all, because in the pasuk that he quotes, it seems like he's involved in Torah study, kol yemei chayecha. So we're not talking about a brand new chiyuv that emerges at the day of his death, on the day, but rather a continuation of the chiyuv Talmud Torah that he's been discussing, that on a daily basis a person is chayiv in Talmud Torah. Therefore, I would suggest a different approach to the Rambam. We know that Talmud Torah is made up of two parts, and we've discussed this numerous times. There's Limud HaTorah, the Maisa Limud, and then there's Yedias HaTorah. And it seems to me, and here I'm leaving the Avodas HaMelech behind, because the Avodas HaMelech is learning that there's a Limud Torah, Maisa Limud at Shas Misa, but I think, no, the Rambam's talking about Yedias HaTorah, because the Rambam puts this whole Shas Misa into a perspective of Shichacha. He doesn't want you to forget your Torah because of the love of Pen Yasur Bilvacha. He wants to guarantee that you'll have the clincher that will avoid Shichas HaTorah, because it's not enough to learn Torah, but you have to know the Torah. You have to remember the Torah. And the opposite of Shichacha is Yedias HaTorah. And if you don't have that clincher that's going to guarantee your Yedias HaTorah, then you'll end up with Shichachas HaTorah, and therefore you'll violate the Pen Yasur Milvavcha. The Kol Yimei Chayecha is revealing something about the nature of the Chiyuv Talmud Torah, which the Rambam has already discussed many times before. Like, for example, the child has to learn Torah because it says V'limad Tamosim Espenechen, and every student has to learn Torah because of Vishinantum Levanecha. And if your father didn't learn Torah, you have a Chiyuv of Ushmartem Lasosam, right? And all the different psukim. And the Rambam says it's got to be day and night, because the Torah says V'gisabo Yom V'layla, right? The pasuk in Yoshua. So we have all these psukim that tell us that you should be learning Torah, and that the Chiyuv Torah is a constant Chiyuv Torah. Obviously, whenever you have the ability to learn Torah, you should be learning Torah, and that preoccupation should take you, says the Rambam, all the way to the end, all the way to the finish line. Because the moment you stop, says the Rambam, you're going to forget your Torah. And the Rambam spells it out very clearly. Kol zman shelo yasak b'Torah shochech. Shochech means he forgets his Torah, which is obviously antithetical to Yedias HaTorah. And in a certain sense, again, pardon me for making this analogy, but it's a little bit similar to the mitzvah of Pirya V'Rivya, because that mitzvah actually will only be fulfilled on the day of your death, because nobody knows what's going to happen between today and the day of your death. So you really haven't finished the mitzvah until the day of your death. It's almost like bris milah. Bris milah, if you didn't do bris milah in its time, will give you all the way till the last breath that you breathe. And if your Yedias HaTorah is guaranteed, is solid, is reliable, then we'll only know that at Shas Misa, because that's the moment that you'll be able to show for yourself what Yedias HaTorah you have. And one of the first questions they'll ask you when you get up there on that pitching Sunday is, Asakta B'Torah. What can you tell me? Can I test you on that which you learned? Did you remember it or did you forget it? So therefore, was suggesting that the Rambam is not deriving this from Rabbi Yonasan. Had he done so, and he was interested in being a mechadish, a new chiyuv of Talmud Torah generated by Shas Misa, then two things would have happened. Number one, he wouldn't have said ad emasai, because ad emasai indicates that we're talking about a chiyuv that's already been discussed and established, and we just want to know until what point in time it goes and goes and goes. Nor does the Rambam quote the pasuk Adam ki yomas ba'oel, which is a gewaldige chiddush written in this pasuk. The Rambam should have certainly, all the other new chiyuvim that the Rambam establishes, and there are many of them, they're all derived from a pasuk. Why doesn't the Rambam derive this new chiyuv of Shas Misa from the pasuk Adam ki yomas ba'oel? Shenemar Adam, he doesn't. But rather, the Shenemar, the Rambam, is to tell you that which we've been talking about until now, the Chiyuv Talmud Torah that we've established from the beginning of Perek Aleph all the way to Halacha Yud, that continues until Yom HaMisa. And the Rambam says what underlies that is your obligation of Yedias HaTorah. If you didn't have to remember your Torah, you could forget it, then okay, so there'll be different points in time when you won't study Torah, okay. But the Rambam is saying no. If there'll be points in time, even up to and including Yom Misa, where you're not involved in Torah study, that'll create shichacha, and the Torah prohibits shichacha, pen yasur milvavcha, kol yemei chayecha, because there's a chiyuv of Yedias HaTorah. And shichacha is antithetical to Yedias HaTorah. They're two opposites. Yedias HaTorah doesn't mean that on Sunday of January 1st, I knew the following Torah. No, that's not Yedias HaTorah. The Yedias HaTorah means that on Monday, I remember my Torah. On Tuesday, etc., etc. So therefore, if you happen to have the pages that David was kind enough to circulate in the email, you'll see in the fourth paragraph, Nira de Kavanis Rambam Lidin Midine Chovas Yedias HaTorah. And the Chiv of Yedias HaTorah excludes, I shouldn't say excludes, precludes Shichachas HaTorah. And you're not allowed to forget your Torah because the Torah says, Pen Yasur Milvavcha. It's almost like you have a very precious but fragile glass, vase, maybe it's, it's an import, an artistic creation from hundreds of years ago. It's an antique, and you have to be very, very careful with it. If you slip and fall, even for a minute, you can smash it to smithereens, and I don't have to tell you chaval azman, So therefore, the Torah knowledge that you've achieved has to be protected. It has to have a shmirah, and that shmirah means that you should continue learning constantly until Yom Mosa, without any hefsek. Because once you have a hefsek, it's as if you dropped a glass and you're going to forget your Talmud. You're going to forget your Torah. So to prevent Shichachas HaTorah, which is prohibited, you have to be in a limud tmidi that takes you all the way up to and including Yom Misa, because Kol Zman Shelo Yasik B'Torah Hu Shocher. I find it so fascinating, this Rambam, because if a Rosh Yeshiva or a Mashgiach today in the yeshiva world would get up and say this, it would be like a perfect shmooze, you know what I mean? But who expected it from the Rambam? The Rambam is this, cold, calculated, formulator of strict halachas. But now he's telling you, buddy, no hefsek in your Torah. Now here, I'd like to take a look at a sugya moed katan about cherem, meaning excommunication. And one of the things that is prohibited in terms of our relationship to someone who's in cherem is we're not allowed to teach him Torah or be taught Torah by him. And that's a Gemara Moikot that says Muchram, referring to someone who's in Cherem, he's been excommunicated for whatever serious violation. Lo Shoneh, he doesn't teach us. V'lo Shonim Lo, and we don't teach him. Because in either case, he's, you're establishing a give and take, a chavrusa kind of Talmud Rebbe relationship that is prohibited in the context of a cherem. But then the Gemara goes ahead and says, Avol shona huli atzmo. He's not exempt from Talmud Torah. He's got to learn Torah. Shelo yafsik es limudo. Just because you're in cherem and you can't teach the normal Torah that you have to teach, you would want it, or you can't be taught the Torah and participate in the shir, don't think that you're exempt from Talmud Torah. You're in your own world, in the privacy of I, myself, right? I, myself, and I, right? And I have to learn Torah. But the language of the Brisa in Moed Katan is fascinating. The Brisa says, Lo yafsik es limudo. It doesn't say chayav b'talmud Torah, but lo yafsik. And what is the problem of being mafsik b'limudo? Let's say he's in cherem for 30 days. Let him take a break for 30 days. You know what I mean? Let him be alone and maybe contemplate his tshuva process for 30 days. What's this business about lo yafsik es limudo? And the answer I found in the Rambam. The Rambam quotes this Gemara and adds a few words. The Rambam is in Perek Zayin, the last Perek of Hilchas Talmud Torah. Halavai, we should live that long to get to that Perek. At the rate we're going, it's going to be about 150 years. Anyway, the Rambam says that Muchram eino shona lacherem ve'ein shonim lo, avol shona hu li'atzmo. And here the Rambam adds a point here. Instead of quoting the Brisa verbatim, namely Yolo Yafsik es limudo, the Rambam says Shelo yishkach talmudo. And again, the Rambam is establishing the following equation: hefsek equals shichacha. Do you have that? It's brilliant. Hefsek equals shichacha. So if you're telling me lo yafsik bilimudo, even though he's in cherem and he has no way of learning or teaching, nevertheless he's going to forget his learning. So there's again this same idea that starts over here in Perek Aleph, but culminates in Perek Zayin, that hefsek equals shichacha. And you remember I gave you that mashal about a glass vase. That's actually a brisa in Avos de Rabbi Nosson. I didn't invent the wheel here. Koshim divrei Torah liknosam kiklis uvim v'nochim li'avdom kiklis chuches. Now, of course, if you acquire some possession of value, you don't want to lose it. Le'avdon means you're going to lose it. So Torah is not something that went in and went out. No. It's like a possession that you could be ma'abed. You could actually lose the Torah that you acquired. Be careful. Omar Kodesh Baruch Hu Yisrael, divrei Torah shenasati lechem, im atem mishamrim oso tov. If you'll be very careful about them and treat them as you would treat a fragile glass vase, that's fine. Im lav, ani notos nafshechem. And this seems to be a support for the Rambam, because if you recall, we made a big deal about the fact that the Rambam quotes the Pasuk in Parshas Vaschana, the Pasuk that says, Pen Yasur Milvavcha. Well, that's where the Avos Rabbi Nosson derives this conclusion that we're obligated to be careful with that Divrei Torah like we are with an expensive glass, fragile vase. And if we're not careful, then the punishment is very severe. That's the language of Avos de Rabbi Nosson. now I want to get back to the question that I asked. How is it practical to tell a person that if he forgets his Torah, he violates an Isur of Pen Yasur Milvavcha? So for that, we have to introduce a concept called Takva Olav Mishnasa, which you'll see on the bottom of page 1, going on to page 2, and it's a language of the Mishnah in the third parak of Avos, of Masechta Avos. Yachol, which always introduces the Havamina. Perhaps I would entertain the idea that under all circumstances, no exceptions, barring nothing, I violate this issue of Shicha if I forget the Torah. Yachal afilu takva olav mishnasa. The phrase in the Mishnah is very fascinating. Takva olav. It's almost like Shichacha is an enemy that attacks us. Right? You know what the word litkof means. Here in Israel, unfortunately, we know about this word all the time. We are attacked. Hopefully in Canada, you don't have that problem of being attacked. Whatever. Anyway, so Takva Olav, there's this being, so to speak, which is an adversary, an enemy, and sometimes he defeats us. Torah is all about humility. When you learn Torah, you're humbled by it. I mean, take the parsha that we just read. Who understands Ben Soru Mora, Eishis Yifas Toar? There are so many mitzvahs in this week's parsha that we just read that defy human logic. There's no apparent logic for it, but we have to be mevatel our ratzon to the ratzon of the Eibishter, which means humility. I have to have humility. And with regard to Shichachas HaTorah, I also have to realize I'm up against great challenges. Takva Olav Mishnasa. So if you're learning Shas, then the adversaries are going to force you to forget Shas or parts of Shas. You just can't handle it all in your brain. Which leads us to a fundamental question. How much of the Torah should I study? Should I be studying constantly and moving on more and more and more until I get to the point where I fill my capacity of Torah and then I start forgetting my Torah? It's Takva Olav Mishnasa. Or maybe I should take a different path. Limit the amount, the discipline of Torah that I want to focus on, review it 101 times until I remember it like in the middle of my sleep. It's like becomes like my phone call, my phone number. Well, I shouldn't say that because we could even forget our phone number. But so therefore, the Mishnah in Avos has to give us some sort of a protection and a limitation in the violation of the Isur. It can't be that because I learned so much Torah and my brain doesn't have the capacity to remember Torah, so when I introduce new Torah, it pushes out of my brain more Torah. I'm not a computer. I'm not a robot. I can't handle it all. And you're going to tell me I violate the Isur of Shichacha because one Torah pushed out the other Torah. And that's Takva Olav Mishnasa. So the Mishnah quotes the pasuk Pen Yasuru Milvavcha. And the Mishnah in Avos has an interesting biur or interpretation of Yasuru. Yasuru is not describing a reality, a situation in which you forgot your Torah. Yasuru is describing an action in which you were involved in something that forces you to forget your Torah. Eino mischayev ad sheyeshev v'yasiram milibo. Yasiram bekum vaseh. You actively did something to forget your Torah. So you're not chayev for the isur shichacha if you didn't actively cause yourself to forget, because that's called takfal of mishnasa. That's like onus rachmana patre. Yeah, Adarab, it's the Torah that came in that forced some of the Torah to go out, because there wasn't enough room in my brain for all the Torah. So the Rambam came up with the following formula. What would be an active violation of pen yasur milvavcha? When would it be that yasiram milvavcha, that he actively caused himself to forget? And the Rambam answers hefsek. Hefsek equals shichacha. Shichacha equals hefsek. And that's a violation of yeshev v'yasiram milvava. So it's fascinating because, the Rambam in the previous halacha discussed the pasuk of the Gisa bo yom v'layla, and the Rambam set up a bare minimum of limud Torah by yom u'balayla, like an hour in the day and an hour at night. So therefore, you could walk away from the Rambam thinking, mistakenly, that it's okay. I learned an hour in the morning. I did my daf, or whatever I did, Shnai Mikra, and then at night I did my daf, did another hour at night, and that's it. I could walk away. The rest of the day, I'm free to, to play baseball. No, says the Rambam. You have an obligation to prevent shichacha. And only constant learning throughout your life, till the end of your life, would prevent shichacha. Because if you take a break, then that hefsek is going to cause shichacha. But again, if that shichacha is a result of liman Torah, that's called takfal of mishnasa, and that's not a violation of this law. So it seems to me that when we read the Rambam, the obligation for constant learning below hefsek up until yomoso is not just a bittul essay if you had the opportunity to learn, but it's more than that. It's an avera of pen yasur milvavcha, of shichas haTorah. It's an active shichas haTorah through hefsek. Very strange concept. Normally, you violate a los haseh by doing an action. There are very few lavim in the Torah that you violate b'shei v'al taseh with the lack of action. Like, let's say, for example, maybe nosar. You didn't eat the kodshin, so you were shevi altas, or you took a neder that you'll eat this kikar of lechem before nightfall, and you didn't do so. There are cases that are rare and far between where you can violate a lo taseh b'shevi al taseh passively, and I think the Rambam is classifying pen yasur milvavcha as a lo taseh, which you violate b'shevi al taseh, being passive, by sitting and being mafsik milimuda. There's another mission in Avos that I think takes us on a different path. He's learning Torah, and then all of a sudden he sees a beautiful tree, and he says, Ma yafa ilun zeh. That would be a case of an active hefsek. He was involved in Torah, and he actively was mafsik. I don't believe that that's what the Rambam is talking about here, because the Rambam is talking about a continuum of learning ad yom moso. He's not talking about someone who in the middle of his learning decides to take a coffee break, which he doesn't need to do. Maybe he does, but I'm saying if he doesn't need to do it. But rather, the Rambam has a violation of a lo taseh bik shevi al taseh, passively, by being mafsik milimud. So we have now Hasoras HaTorah, which is a violation of Pen Yasur Milvavcha, and we have a constant Chiyuv and Mitzvah of Esek HaTorah. Both exist simultaneously. What I'm not sure about, and I'd like to think about this between now and next time we get together, how does it work? When I study Torah and I understand the Torah, don't ask me about today's stuff, but when that happens occasionally, right? I understand the Torah. Do I fulfill the mitzvah of Yedias HaTorah? And if I do something to forget that Torah by being mafsik, then I forfeit and I'm abed that zchuchis, and I lose that Yedias HaTorah. Or do we say no? Maybe the Yedias HaTorah has to take me from point X all the way to Yom Moso, all the way to the end. Okay, that's a very abstract chakira, which Amir Hashem, we're going to cover, if we can, next time we meet. All right, so we'll stop here, and I thank you and wish you a great week. Very profound Rambam. I hope you got something out of it.